My name is Vika Krieger, and I'm the head of technology policy and partnerships for the World Economic Forum, and I'm part of the leadership team at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and we're so honored to be hosting you all here in the Presidio this week. And the theme of this week's convening is creating value in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And so you might be asking yourself, what is the Fourth Industrial Revolution? And for the few of you who may not have read Professor Schwab, the founder of the Forum's book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, we decided before we kick off our afternoon discussions about agile governance in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we'd pull up a quick video to give you some context about what we're talking about.
The original Industrial Revolution was driven by the discovery that you could use steam engines to do all kinds of interesting things.
That was followed by additional revolutions for electricity and computers and communications technology. We're now in the early stages of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is bringing together digital, physical, and biological systems.
One of the features of this Fourth Industrial Revolution is that it doesn't change what we are doing, but it changes us.
We need a different economic model that will allow us to meet the basic needs of every human on the planet, and that will be focused not on growth per se, but on maximizing human well-being.
We have energy technologies that can power our civilization, but how do we get it and implement it at the scale we need at a price that people around the world can afford?
If we're able to do something to transform cities, to make them more efficient, then the impact can be huge.
We can use asset tracking, we can use IT, we can use 3D printing to decouple growth from the resource constraints we have.
The question of adding quality to quantity, it's really about a diverse, safe, healthy, and just world with clean air, clean water, clean energy.
Together we are fighting to preserve our fragile climate from irreversible damage and devastation of unthinkable proportions.
The prediction of 5 million jobs lost by 2020 to technology is serious, but the main question is, how will we define work? How will we share the wealth?
How can you have a doctor that really knows a lot about data? How can you have a biologist that knows about medicine?
We have to create a space that enables people to think freely, to think divergent thoughts, to think creative thoughts.
We really need new education or new training.
We're working with A World in Motion and First Robotics, trying to encourage students from 3rd grade all the way up through the end of high school to pursue science, math, and different technologies.
It's this ability of digital technology to change outcomes, to truly empower people that can create a more equitable growth.
Fourth Industrial Revolution has the potential to make inequalities visible and to make them less acceptable in the future.
I was the first person in the world to be able to voluntarily move my legs while stepping in a robot. The cure will be possible if enough of the right people have the will to make it happen.
We're seeing this incredibly exciting convergence of genome editing, DNA sequencing. Governments have a very important role to play in enabling the safe and effective use of technologies.
We need to take responsibility at every level of society to adapt to these technological challenges, which are redefining what it means to be completely embedded in this world.
Even though we have everyday problems we have to solve, we have to find a way to lay the foundations for the innovations of tomorrow.
So that's the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And the Fourth Industrial Revolution is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about in my previous job before I joined the World Economic Forum earlier this year to help build the center. Previously, I served in the US State Department. For those of you non-Americans, that's our foreign ministry. And I served, my most recent role was as ambassador to the faraway land of Silicon Valley. So I was actually sent here by our State Department to look at all different types of emerging technologies and how those might play out on the international stage and what types of policies might we need to put in place to shape the trajectory of those technologies. And what I learned in that position, both in my engagement with government officials from across the US, but also international governments and my counterparts overseas, is that policymakers don't really know that much about technology and don't spend that much time thinking about technology. Of course, that's a stereotype, and there are many policymakers who do know, are quite deep and up to date on tech, but by and large, governments tend to think of technology as something that just happens, and then it's the role of government to respond to the impacts of that technology. And as we're seeing in the fourth industrial revolution, technology is having an immense impact on every aspect of our lives, how we live, how we work, how we interact with our environment, how we relate to each other, even what it means to be human. And issues like jobs and skills, issues like privacy and security, those have historically been the remit of government. Government has been their job to ensure that those values are enshrined across society. But technology is moving so fast that oftentimes government can't keep up. And here over the past day and today and tomorrow as well, we've been having a lot of conversations about artificial intelligence, for example. But earlier this year, we had the U.S. Treasury Secretary came out and said that he doesn't see AI having a significant impact for another 50 years, and it's not something that's on the government's radar. And so I bring this up just to point out the gap between how government thinks about technology, the time frames, how to be proactive and lean in on technology, versus how you all in the private sector might be thinking about emerging technology trends. And so this gap is what we're here to discuss today. It's why the forum decided to create the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution here in San Francisco, so that we can help create the policies and the frameworks that are necessary to unlock the benefits to society of all of these emerging technologies. And it's also what we're going to talk about in our breakout groups. Later this afternoon, we're going to have sessions on AI, on Internet of Things, on autonomous vehicles, on virtual reality, on blockchain, so that we can do a deep dive. But here, we're going to have a bit of a higher level discussion on what is the role of both the public sector and the private sector in governing and shaping the trajectories of these technologies in the fourth industrial revolution. Normally, when we think of governance, we think of government. But that paradigm doesn't apply anymore in the fourth industrial revolution, in that private sector companies have just as much a role to play, and some might argue even more of a role to play in the governance of emerging technologies than even has traditionally been played by government. And so I'm really excited to introduce our diverse panel that we have here, crossing the public and private sector, and often each of these people within themselves crossing sectors. And so excited to introduce, I'll go down the line. First to my left, you have Hardik Bhatt, who is the Chief Digital Officer for the state of Illinois and also the CIO, and comes from a long career in the private sector, fintech in particular. We have Betsy Cooper, who is the Executive Director of the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity.
Good job.
And previously served in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and other roles in government, and brings a wealth of experience as well. We have Peter Doolin in the next chair over there, who is the Executive Vice President of Digital Transformations and Innovation at Salesforce.com, which is one of the partners of our center, one of our founding partners for the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Thank you.
And all the way on the end is my former fellow diplomat, Brandon Lee, who is the Consul General for the Canadian government here in California, and has done a lot of work in the foreign ministry and across the Canadian government in innovation and tech, and of course also before his time in government has a private sector startup fintech background. And so we've got a great panel to kick things off today. And so considering that most of the people in this room come from a private sector perspective, Peter, I'd love to kick things off with you, recognizing that there is this gap between how fast the private sector wants to move, how fast technology is moving, and how slow sometimes government can be to react. What is the role of companies, and particularly the role of leadership, CEO level people, in terms of bridging this gap?
Mm-hmm. No, great question, by the way. Thank you very much for coming today. It's great to have a full house. Peter Doolin from Salesforce. I should point out that
Prior to my tenureship at Salesforce, I spent 10 years at another technology company as the Chief Technology Officer for their government division based out of Washington, D.C. So I have spent a lot of time wandering the hallways of the Senate and House buildings trying to convince staffers to insert sentences into bills to make sure that we could get paid. So there is a certain, there's a certain prophetic torture that goes with that, being here on stage and to share my pain over the last 15 years. So I wanted to sort of express that we have seen a mind shift in the last few years that if you don't participate, really tragic things can happen if you're not careful. And government is sometimes sort of bemeanored by being a slow-moving behemoth, poor to listen, ineffective. The reality is that if you do partner with governments, they can be extraordinarily fast to react. They can drive tremendous change when they are aligned effectively. You only have to look at certain amazing things that governments have done around the world over the past few years to respond to certain crises in the financial services sectors, in the housing sectors, et cetera, in the automotive sectors, to see that if government does the right thing and is appropriately informed, great partnerships can be formed, great things can happen. So we look at it like the following way, and we, as you probably are aware with Salesforce, we conform, or we believe in deeply in what we call the stakeholder theory, is the fact that the stakeholders are not just our shareholders, but it's everyone. It's the communities, it's the environment, it's the employees, the partners, the governments with which that we trade and which we operate as a company. And it's very important for us to have a relationship, a deep relationship with all of them. And one of the things that I've noticed, and which I've been very proud of with our CEO, Mark Benioff, of course, is that he's been quite courageous in being a voice and mixing, let's just say, business and government and business and politics to a place where maybe certain companies traditionally would be uncomfortable, having a chief executive officer having a social stance on topics of importance like equality, gender balance, and others. It's important, I think, that as our customers look at us, they understand the culture and the leadership with which that they're engaging with. And I think it's super important that if you think of it for a moment, one of the things that Mark has made very, very clear is that we companies need to participate much more fundamentally in that governance process. And we're committed to the 5 million apprenticeships by 2020 to bring apprenticeships into the United States to drive the ability to bring inclusive jobs into the environment. That is good economics for our companies that allows us to have the types of talent pools that are required to have the next generation of people inside our companies, in our partners, in our communities. And I think it's super important. And I would leave you with one thought before I transition back, which is, John F. Kennedy said something very interesting. He said, and if I could sort of paraphrase this and sort of change it around, is, it's not what your country can do for your company, it's what your company can do for your country. And I think it's super important. I think it's something whereby if you start to think about how effective your valuable time would be, Tom, your valuable time would be if you were able to walk down into, as you represent General Dynamics, as you think about what it is that goes on in the minds of politicians and their staffers, they don't have time to read the bills that go in front of them. In the Houses of Parliament in London or in Canada, our legislatures are extraordinarily distracted. And they need help from us in industry to help them understand and to educate themselves effectively on the impact of these technologies. To have an elected official worry and say something like 50 years from now, artificial intelligence or such like technologies will have an impact on my country or my business, is really a reaction of the fear of the unknown. And if we're able to help lead a path that shows growth, shows jobs, shows the impact of our communities, I think we can have an incredible, incredible moment. And I would like to just finish with this last thought, which is we want to be optimistic. I see and I read so much about the fear and uncertainty of the fourth industrial revolution, what it will do to the revolution that's approaching us. And a lot of revolutions have not ended very well. A lot of the revolutions have toppled prior establishments. This is our opportunity to have a revolution that is a gain for everyone. And I think for those of you who have read what we are thinking about at Salesforce, you will know that we are trying to democratize access to technology in every way. And if we can make it as inclusive as possible for people to participate, I think we'll all have a better world. So that's our initial perspective.
So, Peter, I think you make a really compelling case for why companies need to step up and to step into the fray when we're talking about both governance broadly, but thinking about the societal impacts of technology. So I buy the what we need to do. My next question is, how do companies do that? So Hardik, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Illinois, about how can we effectively bring companies into the governance and policy process and thinking about the societal impacts of technology.
Absolutely, I'd love to. And first of all, thank you very much, Murat and Elizabeth and you. I mean, it's been a great partnership. It's a short partnership so far, just a couple months, but going great. And before I answer that, I do want to second what Peter just said is, you know, if you think about what we've been doing for the past 30, 40 years with technology, has been pretty much contained within an organization. The impact of that is contained within the organization, except when we talk supply chain and we are talking the entire gamut of the suppliers and also the people that get that. We are getting into a completely different environment now, starting with data. I'll give you an example where, you know, we are using data to change how the government serves our customers. So whether it is health, human services, public safety, business, and workforce. And a lot of data that we have for the citizens is not 100%. It's not a 360-degree view. Just healthcare, the data that we have in the government databases doesn't even cover half of the picture. We need to get more kind of platform-like solutions, analytic solutions that can not only bring all of the data, but also then give us the analysis on that particular customer of ours. We are looking at that as customer. So how we are operating in the state of Illinois is we knew, I mean, I come from Cisco, and it's not fintech, it's IoT. That's in my background, and I worked extensively globally. And one of the things that I saw that the governments that have been progressive and have been successful in transformation have always had private sector engaged significantly. So as soon as the governor and I started a couple of years ago, the first thing that we did was we brought our major corporations in Illinois, whether it's Boeing, State Farm, Healthcare Services Corporation, Caterpillar, but we also brought the industry, the Ciscos, the Microsofts, IBMs, IDC, AT&T, Verizon. We brought all of them in a tent, and we basically built a working group with the governor and myself that kind of looked at not just the current technology, but the application of those technology into how do we turn the government into being a digital government. We had large, like Boeing has 400 data analysts on their team, and their CDO mentored my CDO, my Chief Data Officer. Caterpillar CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, mentored my CISO, and they actually provided input into our cybersecurity strategy. Like Berkeley, we have the University of Illinois. The professors there actually provided input in building our comprehensive cybersecurity strategy. So everything that we have done in the past couple of years, and the reason why we've been able to bring Illinois from the bottom 4th in 50 states to top 3rd in digital outcomes, is because we have actively engaged the private sector. The next wave, we actually need to even engage more, and I'll come to that momentarily in your follow-up questions. But absolutely second what Peter said is we all have to think what our company can do for our country. I think that's, this game is not individual sector game, it is an ecosystem game.
Great, so I think that, you know, we talk about the role that governments have historically played, and it's very, you know, here we have the bias from talking from an industry perspective of the need to lean forward, the need to move fast, the need to go along with the technology trends and to move with the momentum. But, you know, governments need to think about issues like safety, like security, like privacy. Betsy, I'd love to hear your perspective, both from having spent time in federal government and, of course, a lot of the really innovative work you're doing at UC Berkeley. How do we balance the need for speed with the need to protect citizens, which is really the core interest of government?
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to get to bring a little bit of Berkeley over to San Francisco once in a while, so appreciate the opportunity to be here. I think a couple things. So first, we at Berkeley are really focused on a lot of the issues that you are working on in your new center, including artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things. And I think the Internet of Things is particularly useful to think about here because the way that the Internet of Things has developed is partially through a first-to-market, real minimum viable product perspective. And frankly, this is, I come from the Silicon Valley world, and we are driving this perspective. The reason that some of these attacks have been able to happen is that the Internet of Things devices, whether it's your smart toothbrush, and I don't know why anyone needs a smart toothbrush, but your smart toothbrush or your baby monitor has security, has the internet built into it with no security capabilities. And so we're not thinking about those issues about security, privacy, data collection. We're just trying to get that product out to market. And so at Berkeley, we think that there's a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account, and this is where the real conversation begins between government and the private sector. But the difficulty with traditional public-private partnerships is that we begin to engage with them, and then there often is a breaking point where either government procurement is too slow and we can't get something moving, or the company is worried about the risk of regulation and doesn't want to share, so the conversation isn't open enough to lead to a final conclusion. And so we think that in beginning to talk about this new industrial revolution and the new products that we're building, we have to find new and creative ways to open those conversations. So one of our research priority areas is new governance and regulatory regimes, by which we don't mean necessarily government regulation in the traditional sense, but finding new ways that private sector and the public sector can engage that don't lead to these stalemates like they have in issues such as the Internet of Things.
So what I'm hearing is that there's a bit of a tension where, what is the right place for government to intervene? If you intervene too early, then you risk maybe perhaps stifling innovation or getting in the way. But if you intervene too late, you might have some, like the example you gave with cybersecurity, you risk that industry being disaggregated, people not thinking about these core societal implications, both positive and negative of these technologies, so government may be abdicating its responsibility in this space. So Brandon, I'd love to hear your thoughts about how maybe your government is thinking about or experiences that you've seen in balancing this tension.
Thank you. And I think, thank you for having me. And I think the having government people in an event, in the center, I think is very forward-thinking and visionary itself. But when I look at the role of government in innovation, I would put it maybe, I would categorize three groups. There's visionary policymaking, and this is, I think, the subject of what we're talking about now, all the sectors and what is in the realm of the possible. Then there's smart government policymaking. And when we talk about smart, in fact, governments not taking a decision, being slow to create policy, being slow to create regulation is actually smart in many cases. And so maybe many of you are frustrated, but we can, I would love to have this debate further, but often it's intentional. Because once you create regulation, then it's very hard to backtrack. And as government, as many of you as heads of your organizations, when you create a policy, it takes a long time for the organization, a country, a municipality, a state, for that to filter and for people to align. So to not take a decision and take a decision at the right time is very important. And then the third bucket, I think this is where most of us, including government people, are frustrated, are where regulation already exists. Because this is where regulatory reform, now this is a sector or a bucket of things that is very difficult to address. So I would categorize it in this way, and government generally, I would say, being from government, maybe the Chatham House rules we can put into effect, but I myself am skeptical when I hear top-down government policy being driven. When it's not created in partnership with private sector, with civil society, with academia, when that group think doesn't come, when it's not manifest from that group think, then I myself am very skeptical, actually. And I would prefer the middle bucket of taking our time before jumping into things.
So Peter, from your experience, what can be some of the consequences of government either stepping in too early or stepping in too late?
Some of them are tragic. I think, did I say that? Are we on the record? Okay, so I think, Just to follow on, by the way, one thought I'd like you to think about is the type of person you're putting into your government affairs departments in your companies that go talk to governments. Typically, they're filled with the ranks of a legal or maybe a governmental regulatory background. I can tell you, having walked into dozens upon dozens of senators' offices in the United States government process, that their eyes roll back into their heads as soon as they see them walk in the door. Because there's nothing new going to come from that interaction. They know what's going to happen with that interaction. If you can inject just a little bit of tenacity, just a little bit of courage, and put somebody who's got some fire and maybe some brimstone going on, you'll find an opportunity to build relationships that you probably have never thought possible. And I would just ask you to consider that. Take someone out of your innovation team and say to them, would you like to spend a couple of months with our government team, wandering up and down after committees meet, or even sitting in a committee and actually participating in the committee in some form. I think that would be really, really interesting. My first interaction in the committee was in the House Armed Services Committee giving testimony around the inability of the VA, the Veterans Administration, and the Military Health Service, MHS, which is part of the Department of Defense, to exchange basic electronic records information back and forth.
We still haven't fixed it.
Well, we're just about to fix it because the Secretary got up yesterday and said enough of this, and we're going to go with a commercial offering after 15 plus years of debate. So that was actually, there are winners and losers in that conversation, but the winner, I think, will be the service member, and I think the winner will be the taxpayer. In making sure that we have an effective process. So that's just one of my ideas for you to take back and look at the resume and the LinkedIn profile of your Government Affairs Committee and see what's happening. But to answer your question, what things can go wrong? For my sins, I led the Cash for Clunkers program here in the United States for about 3 months. Anyone remember what that was? Okay, wow, look at that. All the automotive people hands go up. Okay, so Cash for Clunkers was a reaction, a very quick reaction. It was a bill written by President Obama, and the bill said in it that we had 27 days to implement the program. It was one of the few bills that said we're going to put $1 billion to inject into the automotive industry. We are going to give you 1 month, 27 days after. It took a few days for the clerk of the House to sign it and everything else. It took 27 days for us to implement an ERP and then hand out in increments of $2,750, which is the voucher you would get for trading in a clunker, an old car, and getting a new car. And the idea was very simple, if you remember. It was to have more fuel-efficient, less emissions vehicles on the road and to drive the US economy and get the machines back to work, get the assembly lines back to work, and get jobs back to work. Well, of course, what probably you remember happened was that people traded in perfectly good 5-year-old vehicles and from companies that are very near and dear to the average American's heart. These are stable stakes, brand name companies that you've grown up with all your life. And instead, they were replaced with predominantly cars that are maybe manufactured elsewhere and came in from outside of the country. And as someone who likes to work on my old Jeep, by the way, and I'm a huge Jeep fan, there's my plug for US business, spare parts for Jeeps just dried up because, of course, the aftermarkets business, which thrives on decomposing those used products and recycling them back into the economy, completely disappeared. Because why? The bill said that the product had to be destroyed. And it said that they had to be destroyed because there was a fear of fraud. There was a fear of the product re-emerging on the market. So there was an example of a bill written in haste with all great intentions, all good intentions. However, had we had the time to go a little bit slower, to have a little bit more contemplation, to think about the good, the bad, the ugly of that bill, we could have had a very different outcome. We could have used that money to generate so much more. So I'm not advocating for or against it. I lost 3 months of my life. It was an amazing rush to go from signing a bill to owning the project to actually being held accountable by about half a dozen committees in Congress for every single penny of the $3 billion we ended up spending. I think it's an example of where, to my earlier points, when I mentioned government can move fast, I actually have lived it. It can go so fast that sometimes you run over the intended patient that you're trying to bring comfort to. So it all goes back again to the following. I believe and that is that there has to be an ongoing healthy dialogue constantly between industry, communities, and government. And that iron triangle needs to be healthy. It needs to be something that is fed. It's not something that companies can just go to a meeting and say, why is there a regulation that says I can't put financial data in the cloud? Why is it that I can't have healthcare data in the cloud? Don't you know that, that it's a safer place to put it than inside your database sitting inside that system that has a part-time security officer? I mean, there are unintended consequences of regulation that can be very stifling. But without us in the dialogue with those government entities, they're going to make these mistakes. And they're human, like everybody else.
So Hardik, you've had experience both in the private sector and in the public sector now. What's been the most surprising thing to you, or what insights can you share about the difference between how each sector thinks about regulating technology, governing technology, and unlocking the potential of technology?
Absolutely. The governments do have this tendency of rushing into regulations without understanding the implications of that, as Peter suggested. We are doing that slightly differently. So as the Chief Digital Officer, I'm responsible for, and we might be the only government that is building digital economy strategy, how to contend with AI, AR, VR, and self-driving vehicles and blockchain, etc. And we are taking a lot of input from the private sectors. We are speaking with majority of the major corporation CEOs, but beyond that, we are also talking actively with the entrepreneurs and the VC community, because they are skating where the puck's going. The VCs are investing where the technologies are going, hopefully. And so we are getting a lot of input from them. We're getting a lot of input from our academic people also. And an example, so blockchain, you know, one of the US states a year or 2 years ago rushed into regulating the digital currency and got a lot of pushback from the industry. We are doing it slightly differently, where we actually have taken a three-pronged approach for blockchain. One is, obviously, we are going to do a lot of RFIs, RFCs, so that we can understand what the industry is thinking about, where the blockchain is going, actively working with our financial and insurance industries to see the implications of that. We have actually built a sandbox environment where we are inviting entrepreneurs and the financial industry to start testing it out with us. And then we are actively pushing for 5 pilots this year. Starting from energy tax credit to education credentials to health registries and so on and so forth, to see, and property deeds. We just heard that in the previous breakout session. So we are actually testing it out before we start regulating that, because I firmly believe, coming from the private sector, that was the same thing that we were talking or advocating from Cisco, is don't start regulating IoT yet, because you don't know what we are going to stifle innovation if we start regulating too quickly. So we are now applying those same principles in our government, where our governor is a private equity. He built a company and ran it for 32 years, and now he is a governor. So he brings a lot of business backgrounds too. So the idea is, we want to make sure that we test the waters, we understand from the industry what is it that, and then come up with maybe joint regulations.
So I find it interesting that you're, as you mentioned, tapping into VCs and startups, because in order to effectively regulate or engage with an emerging technology, we need to know where the technology is going. And I know that from my experience, I worked on a team that spent 2 years writing our regulations around drone exports. And by the time the regulations came out, you could buy drones on Amazon and get them delivered Amazon Prime 2 days later. And so the regulation was irrelevant by the day that it was released. And so clearly having some level of technological foresight, I know that was a future forecasting that was talked a lot about in our morning session today. Betsy, you work a lot on that in your center at Berkeley, thinking about future scenarios. It's a hot topic in the private sector, thinking about what's coming down the pipeline. Government, not so much. What can government learn from the private sector, or how can private sector help government think about what's coming down the pipeline?
Great, thanks. And I think that's a really important question. I guess I'd begin by adding a little disagreement to what Brandon was saying earlier. We were encouraged to actually disagree on a panel, which I know is kind of rare. So, but I do think that, yes, it's incredibly important that we have to find ways to bring all the actors together. But I guess I'm not convinced that we will always be able to reach agreement or that perfect agreement, especially with so many disparate interests. We see this all the time in the privacy and security space, where we have people on extreme views and they're never going to be able to reach that agreement. And as we've talked about, delaying regulations for too long can lead them to be out of dates. And as one of the lawyers in the room, I can also say it can lead to court cases, which sometimes may be equally unpreferable to regulation. So there are reasons to, be able to have decisions made at some point where that needs to happen. But I do think the overall point of bringing the private sector and government together has to come down to this sort of consultation model, where we bring those engagements together with people from academia, from civil society, to really engage. So on that point, I definitely agree. And I think the future is the right space in which to do that. Often if we begin by discussing an issue that's already has legislation pending or where there are court cases pending, it is too late. We already have the sides that are decided where to go. I think you could use the sort of Apple FBI tension from last summer to show how hard it would be now to bring together a conversation on that topic. But what we can do is use things like scenario planning to project critical uncertainties that may be coming down the pipeline and to begin to prepare for them now. So that's exactly what our center does. We engaged in the cybersecurity space in a scenario planning process in which we laid out 5 different scenarios for the way the world would look in the year 2020, whether we have the next great financial crisis or we have hackers sort of winning the day. That one seems to be a little prescient now. Or we have new algorithms or the use of the Internet of Things. And then we ask ourselves, what do governments do? What are the private sector doing? What are hackers or other malicious actors doing? And how can we think about those critical uncertainties? And then we sit in a room with all the relevant actors, with government folks, with private sector folks, and ask, if this world were to come true, and we are not saying it is, we're just using this as an example, but if it were to come true, what would we wish we were doing today to prepare for that future? And I think governments are particularly ill-equipped at the moment to engage in those sorts of conversations. There are pockets of sort of strategy groups that are thinking about that, but a room like this with people who are thinking about strategy from the corporate perspective can really help drive that forward, and we're always looking to partner with folks who are interested in doing that.
But I would say I think it depends on the leaders inside the government, how actively they are pursuing the private sector input. Those that frankly, my governor and I have access to this room full of private sector leaders whenever we want to, because we have shown that leadership and people want to, I think, and what I've seen is, again, I was on the other side too, so everybody in this room wants to contribute to the overall positive impact of government. And there is this whole civic kind of, people want to contribute civically. And I think it's just the governments need to ask the right question and engage the people in the right conversation, and also show that the input that we have taken from them has been acted upon. Because the governments do waste a lot of private sector's time by building advisory boards and building pilots and proofs of concepts and, nothing. Go back and look at how many proofs of concepts or pilots turned into real implementation. So I think those are the kind of things that the governments need to also show that, then we'll get a lot of input.
So, Brandon, I'd love to hear from an international perspective. Where do you see this working? Who's doing this well? Who's maybe not doing so well? Or who has lessons to teach us on an international level?
And thank you for that question. Actually, this morning it was said that location matters, the place matters. And in fact, what we're seeing, obviously we're in the Silicon Valley, which is the global hub of innovation. But we're seeing countries and governments and areas exploding. I would say there's so many areas that are doing very well because of government visionary policy, private sector coming together. And so I think every government, if you ask them what their innovation policy is, they will present a nice paper. But I think the proof is in the pudding. When we speak to startups here, their very quick acid test is Uber legal and is Airbnb legal? or when we look at a lot of our policy reform, we're looking at the federal level, but I see actually municipal level is where those governments have a lot more teeth, a lot more power to implement things and pilot things much quicker than a federal government can. But then to go to your question directly, like who are doing great things? For example, in Singapore, the talent question, they have a policy called the Smart Futures program, where every single citizen has a bank account, and every year the government puts in money for lifelong learning. This is a very interesting policy, so let's see what comes of this. Israel, you know, to stimulate angel early stage investment, they have their capital investor laws that have been put into place to give some tax umbrellas to early stage investors. In Canada, we have a thesis where we're calling it our superclusters program, where for government to drive innovation, it's really, I think the private sector needs to drive, communities need to come together. So our superclusters thesis is we will start to fund superclusters in sectors, so AI, life sciences, et cetera. And as they show traction, as they show job creation, as they show success, then government will continue to fund. So we'll start with a number, and over time, we'll start to fund less and less and less. So it's this, you know, when private sector can prove that they can work together, then government will get behind and support in this way.
So taking a step back, and a question that I'll open up to the whole group is, you know, if government is slow to step in, and if government is not able to keep up with the agility of changing technology, what is the role of the private sector? How can the private sector, should the private sector step up to the plate and start thinking about norms, standards, protocols? Can the private sector self-organize? Can it lead by example?
I'll jump in if I could to be first. Yes, and very much so. I think it behooves the company and its leadership with that government, whether that government is municipal or federal. But it's also another byproduct, which is very important, which is cultures of companies count. The culture of a company is really important. If you want to attract the right kind of talent, if you want to attract the right kind of DNA into your company, then we live in the era of the transparent corporation. You can see everything that's going on inside a corporation. The Glassdoors of the world, I think, was raised already this morning on a previous panel, Blind and others, which provide these verified anonymous platforms for exchange of information that hitherto you would never have had access to. You can now see deeply inside the culture of a company before you ever decide to join it. The current generation is asking hard questions. Do I want to have, or does this company share cultural norms with me? Yes or no? If I am to join this company, then their culture matters. That therefore goes to your question, which is the leadership of that company or that group of companies, are they connected to my community? Are they connected to the issues that are important to me? And I think it's super important for us as leaders and strategists inside industry to have a perspective on this. And if your CEO or CFO or CMO thinks that their job is to come to work, push that needle a little bit more on net present value and shareholder value, et cetera, and that's it, then I think you're missing the very big thing, the tectonic shift that's happening beneath our feet right now with the fourth industrial revolution, because we're connecting our communities and our companies together. Look at the electoral footprint and blueprints we're seeing across Europe right now. Tomorrow morning, we're about to find out very, very clearly in the United Kingdom a strategy that will go forward for Europe and what's going to happen. That didn't happen all by itself. I mean, by the way, all the professionals, the pundits, were surprised. I was in London the morning of the election. I went to sleep like everybody else thinking that it was a foregone conclusion. Woke up the next morning to that amazing picture of Mr. Nigel Farage having that look of surprise on his face. Do you remember that picture on the front page of the newspaper? He was the most surprised person from all of us. So when unintended consequences can happen because of lack of engagement, it behooves us to be super hyper-engaged. And therefore, companies have a role in that process. Hopefully, I've beaten that point to death.
I can add a few things to that. So first, you mentioned, government being behind, and while I think in many cases that's true, it's helpful, I think, to disaggregate and point out that there are cases when governments can be ahead. I mean, certainly if you think about the Department of Defense in the United States or even the NSA, there are tools that they have in terms of technology that may not yet be in the private sector, or where there could be useful exchange of information were that possible in, the classified settings. So I think we need to make sure not to talk about government as a monolith that is always behind. But even when there's that sort of exchange is possible, I do think that in addition to technology transfer between governments, the culture question that you've just raised is extremely important. The Silicon Valley culture, for instance, is very different than the bureaucratic culture of governments. And sometimes the Silicon Valley culture actually helps create innovation and bring together new ideas in ways that are not possible within very clear bureaucratic structures. Having been at the Department of Homeland Security, I can say for sure that it is much harder to innovate in that structure when there are so many different rules to follow and so many different groups to consult before you can go forward with something. So one thing that we've been thinking about is a cyber incubator in our field, cybersecurity, where we bring together the private sector and government out here in the Valley in a place that engages with the culture of the Valley and allows people to innovate in the space of cybersecurity. And I think that that sort of model could apply across a number of industries and help us learn where government really is behind, or maybe has something to contribute on the technology side as well.
I would add that maybe government, and maybe as an invitation to everyone, it's probably the coolest time in history you could join government. The role of government now is more important than ever. As a diplomat, the role of dialogue between countries and nations and peoples is more important than ever. And as we go into the 4IR, the central enormous impact that government can have either for or against an entire country's population, now is the time to join government. And in fact, when I exited my startups in the 90s, I thought I would give it 1 or 2 years to come into government. I've been 15 years now, and it's the most rewarding and challenging job I've ever had.
It's like Steve Case says in the third wave, right? Whether it's third wave of the internet or the fourth industrial revolution, I think this is where you need experts on both sides, or maybe people that have been on both sides and understand how the inner workings are, both in the public sector and the private sector, because you're going to now start solving the food problem, the water problem, the energy problem. These are fundamental we need to figure out the urbanization, increased urbanization problem, the dependence on state aid problem. The thing here that we are looking very closely and working with Murat and Sadia and the team here is, as we encourage the private sector and enable the private sector to automate faster, we are going to see a jump in productivity, but we are also going to see mass scale unemployment. So how do we make sure that that doesn't happen? How do we use Mark Benioff's vision of creating apprenticeship programs and, as a government, not really do those things, but enable the private sector, encourage them to create those programs? I think that's where not only us working together, but I think this cross-pollination of the public sector and the private sector executives is going to be extremely crucial for the next decade.
And if I could, by the way, to riff off that idea, it's not grand gestures by big corporations with big governments that will make this happen. It's those moments of serendipity by your employees. If you set the right culture for them to adopt a school, to adopt a community college, to invest time in mentoring young government leaders as they're coming up through the ranks, if it makes sense for you to invest in having people from your company volunteer their time or even rotate into government positions, obviously there are certain situations you have to be careful there, but in general sense, the point being to participate. And it can happen at the city level. Mayors of cities can move mountains. Governors of states and of provinces can have tremendous ability to act quickly. You look at the government of Australia, you look at New South Wales and Victoria, and you think about what they're doing in enabling them to serve citizens and residents of their communities, about bringing digital government services directly into the palm of their hand with a phone. and having the ability for, I would call boring areas of stagnation like social services become an area of innovation and service, and actually treating residents as customers, not as taxpayers or as burdens, but as a customer that to be served and to bring the learnings from the Googles, the Amazon of the world into those experiences. And I know we're going to be talking about AI and other technologies later, but this is where we have the opportunity to inject these amazing technologies to improve the state of our countries and our communities. Things like education, bringing people back into the workplace who've been disenfranchised because of lack of skills, because of the inability to get access to jobs or access to transportation. These are things that are going to all radically change in the next 5 to 10 years. The idea of scenario planning is something that we should definitely be thinking about. This is a technique and a technology that has been mastered over the last 20+ years and has an opportunity to really give tremendous near-term benefits in the 3 to 5 year event horizon. Why not participate? Because I think the answer that could happen if we don't is we end up with regulations. And by the way, one of my other responsibilities is for our government cloud. I mean, I spend all my time with certain federal entities inside the Beltway arguing over how keys are used for cryptography and where data sits and what the color of the cables are. And I mean, the type of key. I mean, this is Stone Age conversation. This is stuff that will literally make paint peel from walls during the day as you're having those conversations. And why did it end up like that? It ended up like that because they were reacting to the challenges of that time. I mean, politicians have something written on the back of their foreheads, on the inside of their eyelids. Do not end up on the front page of a newspaper for anything other than positive good things. I mean, do no harm is the contracting officer's motto inside the US government. The procurement process requires significant change. I mean, look at our departments of defense, et cetera. I mean, we could argue that our procurement process is almost as restricting us to create capability and safety and security for our population. So the point is that we have an opportunity to engage. And there's an opportunity with the way that we have now social media platforms, the way that we can actually serve. And I would ask the people in this room who have got, been incredibly successful, done incredible things for your companies and for your communities, what would it be like to go and serve the state of Illinois as a CIO, the state of Massachusetts, the city of London, the city of Paris? How could you give back? How could you contribute? And I would ask you to think deeply about how the public-private partnership should not be a one-way street with us waiting for government. We've got to engage deeply and start doing that now.
So building off of that, it seems like, at least I've been seeing an evolution in how companies are thinking about their responsibility to engage in a lot of these big social, societal challenges, and not just from the perspective of CSR, corporate social responsibility, where we should have an employee volunteering day or get involved in local communities, and I don't want to sort of poo-poo that, but thinking about how are some of these big social challenges around that are being created by emerging technology? They're fundamentally altering society in really significant ways, and that's actually starting to cut into the core business model of these companies. And what I've been seeing, particularly from some forward-leaning companies, is an increased acceptance of the responsibility to address the societal impacts of those technologies. And so a question that I want to put to the panel is, what is, I wouldn't frame it as what is the responsibility, but what is the strategic imperative to engage with the societal implications and impacts of technologies, and what is the best ways in which to do that?
Well, I think first you have to begin by understanding the possible implications of your technology. So in the AI sort of machine learning space, one of the key questions that's come up is, how do we understand if those algorithms are accountable? If you're using in a police force the ability to use an algorithm to help select a person, are you building in biases into that algorithm? Or is the algorithm actually pretty good and then the individual overrides that and reintroduces the bias into the human decision making? working. We don't have good metrics for that yet, and for understanding where humans are better, where computers are better, and how to balance those interests. So I think you have to start there. And then I think over time we have to understand that these are governance questions too. How algorithms play into our lives, how the Internet of Things will be able to collect more data, and how big data will affect what we see. I certainly think that the events over the past year have taught us a lot about that in terms of how it's difficult to understand the implications of the things that we see on our screens, but it's only going to get more important. And so the more that companies can play a direct role in that rather than a passive role, I think that's a fantastic start.
Maybe just to jump on that, I wouldn't be surprised if I look at the nature of government. Like government, we don't choose our customers. Our job is to take care of our citizens. So then I wouldn't be surprised if we start seeing departments of algorithm verification opening up. I wouldn't be surprised.
Hopefully with a catchier name, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even, a lot of your sectors, if government's role is to take care of its population and its citizens, but then some of your technologies will result in massive job losses, it's not a big leap for the imagination to think that governments will actually be a little bit hesitant to support these sectors, to create regulatory frameworks that help these technologies expand. So in this way, I think being at the table, I think that's one commonality. The entire duration, the entire process coming along at all levels of government, not just at the political level, but within the bureaucracy, the heads of policy, within municipal, state, federal, at all levels to engage is very important, actually.
But if I could, let me take the side of the private sector here. I think it is good to think that you all will think about your algorithms and making sure that you won't build something that will create massive job loss. But then if that algorithm is going to create you billions of dollars and create a tremendous shareholder value, I think the analysis of job loss is going to take a back seat on that. What I would instead encourage is, when Cisco looked into networking academies, IBM's trying to do P-Tech schools, Microsoft's building analytics curriculum, others are building cybersecurity curriculum. If the private sector can take a joint responsibility of upskilling the workforce with the government, and don't just look at the government running the community colleges and university systems and the K-12 systems to create the educated workforce, that's where we are going to be able to create that new workforce that we need for the next decade. So I would say build those algorithms but then work with the government to make sure that together we can assess the impact and see who, frankly, tell me what are in the next 10 years, 15 years, what are the 5 top job descriptions, and how do we prepare our workforce for that, the new generation as well as the existing workforce. I think that will be a huge contribution from the private sector side to work with the government. Don't look at education as the government's problem, because we all need that educated workforce 10 years from now, today, and 20 years from now too.
The number one thing we hear from our private sector partners is hiring. They can't find enough people to fill their jobs. But at the same time, we have to take the future perspective too. So if I were to sit here and name 2 of those top 5 job categories, I'd say data scientists and security professionals. But I'd also say, do we know whether those jobs will be automated or at least partially automated in 10 years? So I think that we need to see what the different types of skills are and to project that future perspective to make sure that we don't retrain people and then need to retrain them again on a 5-year, so going back to one of the earlier points about the world constantly being in transition, we need to prepare for that being a possibility, or at least understand what is more likely to be automated and what is less.
The last quick point I'd make as well is that education has been seen as a one-and-done process in the past. Governments have created departments of education that say, hey, you finish one process, you go to another process, and you're done. Now we're in a world of continuous, constant education, re-education, and enlightenment. And you've got to engage. Companies like Salesforce, where we have produced a platform like Trailhead, where we say to all of our customers and our partners, all the education is there, go take it. Become certified, socially share all those badges so that you can show that to others that you can be employed or retrained into a new area. Those are areas that every company in this room should be thinking about how you're enabling your ecosystem to move forward in today's world. And if you're not doing that, then you better start doing it, because someone else is thinking about how to take all those skilled workers that are in your ecosystem and move it to their ecosystem. And it's going to happen very quickly.
So I think that's a great point to close things off on. I'll say that at the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, we're partnering with 20 governments, city, state, and national governments to co-develop and pilot policy frameworks to accelerate the benefits of emerging technology and mitigate some of those risks. And I would say that probably the #1 issue that we hear from our government partners that we're working with is this workforce displacement, is upskilling and reskilling. And we've seen here in US politics in our last election that trade was the boogeyman in terms of the job killer, but most people in this room already know that the real job killer what has the potential to be the real job killer is automation, and that while trade may have been in the crosshairs last year, it's only a matter of time before automation and tech could be in the crosshairs if we're not proactive about it. And so I think that this is an opportunity, the people in this room have the opportunity to get out ahead of those dynamics and make sure that we're thinking about taking responsibility for the societal impacts of these technologies. And so this conversation has been a great transition to the sessions that we're going to be having this afternoon, where we'll have the ability to do a deep dive on 5 particular technologies, looking at what are some of the societal impacts of those technologies and what we can do as a multi-stakeholder community. What can we do to address those challenges and opportunities? So we'll have 5 sessions. We have on AI, IoT, blockchain, autonomous vehicles, and VR/AR. And I would ask all of you to, as soon as we end this session, to get up and run to your sessions, since we have a lot to talk about, and we also, one of the sessions will be in here, so we're going to be flipping over this room, so I'd encourage you to make great haste. And I would like to thank all of our great panelists today for a spirited and far-reaching discussion. And we look forward to working with all of you at the center here in San Francisco.
Thank you.